Ethan's excavator slammed into something hard. At first, he thought it was just a rock, but when he heard the deep metallic clang, his heart skipped. Something wasn't right. His dog, Rook, growled, low eyes locked on the earth. Ethan stopped, climbed down, and brushed away the dirt. Beneath the surface, a strange metal door began to emerge, old, rusted, and sealed shut. A chill ran down his spine. What was hidden inside? And why did Rook sense danger? As he reached for the door, the ground trembled, and Ethan realized some secrets are never meant to be found. Ethan Ward's life had settled into a predictable rhythm in the backwoods of Oregon. After years of war and turmoil, he found peace in the quiet expanse of his grandfather's land, where only the wind through the pines and the distant calls of wildlife pierced the silence. He had built a modest cabin, and for the most part, it was just him and his dog Rook, a loyal Belgian Malinois who had seen it all by his side. Rook had been a gift from the military, a partner in war. His instincts had saved Ethan more times than he cared to count, and now back in civilian life, the dog was his constant companion. The bond between them was unspoken, built on shared experience. While Ethan worked the land or took on the occasional construction job, Rook kept watch, always alert, always protecting. Ethan wasn't one for conversation. The world had worn him down, and he had grown used to the peace that came with silence. Most days, he kept to himself. The local veterans hiring program had helped him get a job working on the new highway construction. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady. Digging, clearing, moving dirt. The job felt like something he could do well, something that wouldn't require too much thought, just muscle and routine. After a while, routine became comfort. He had always found solace in the predictability of work, clear tasks, tangible results. Today, as the sun rose high over the land, it was no different. Ethan fired up the old excavator and began his work, the machine's growl filling the air as it tore into the earth. The noise was familiar, the motion steady and rhythmic. Rook sat nearby, watching Ethan work with the patience only a dog could understand. The construction site was nothing special, just a strip of land, some bulldozers and shovels workers scattered in the heat. But as Ethan dug the ground beneath him, seemed to react differently. It wasn't the usual soft soil mixed with rocks and debris. There was something beneath the surface, something that resisted the machine's claw. At first, Ethan thought it was just a stubborn rock, but as the bucket scraped deeper, he heard something unusual. A hollow clang, a sound too deep, too metallic to be a simple stone. The noise struck Ethan differently, almost like a warning bell in his chest. He stopped the machine and stared at the ground for a moment. Rook's ears perked up, his body stiffening as he caught the same odd sound. The dog's growl came low, almost imperceptible at first, but it built rumbling deep from his chest. It was a sound Ethan had heard in the past, a warning that something was wrong. Ethan's gaze shifted from Rook to the site around him. The workers were still moving, unaware of the shift in the air. He climbed out of the excavator, his boots crunching on the gravel. As he walked over to the trench, his heart began to race, the feeling of unease crawling up his spine. The dog's reaction only intensified his own concern. "What is it, boy?" Ethan muttered, looking down at the dirt, unsure whether it was his instincts or the dog's that were driving the anxiety. Rook didn't answer, of course, he never did, but the dog's posture said everything. Something was wrong. Ethan knelt beside the exposed earth and began brushing away the soil with his hands. The more dirt he cleared, the more the object beneath became visible. The outline of something smooth, hard, and unnatural emerged. It wasn't a rock or debris. It was a slab of concrete, its edges straight, its surface oddly pristine despite the years it must have spent buried beneath the ground. His breath caught in his throat. He glanced around, but the workers were still unaware. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary discovery. This wasn't just a buried pipe or a forgotten culvert. No, this felt purposeful, as if it had been hidden for a reason. Rook, Ethan said, but the dog didn't respond to his command. Instead, Rook continued to growl, his stance rigid and unyielding, his eyes locked on the exposed concrete. The veteran's heart began to pound in his chest. It wasn't just the dog's unease that bothered him now. It was the fact that this discovery was pulling him into something far bigger than a construction job. There was history here, and history had a way of catching up with people. Ethan stood slowly wiping the sweat from his forehead. The day was getting hotter, but the chill that crept over him wasn't from the heat. It was something darker, something that whispered of secrets buried long ago, something that Ethan couldn't ignore. He had lived long enough to know when danger was close, when the world around him was about to shift. Rook stepped forward, sniffing the edge of the concrete. Ethan's mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. A hidden door in the earth. It didn't make sense. Why would someone bury something like this in the middle of nowhere? And why now, when he was here of all times, his thoughts were interrupted by the foreman, Dale, shouting from the other side of the site. "What's going on over there?" Ethan didn't look up. His eyes were fixed on the slab. "Something's not right," he called back, his voice low, almost to himself. He bent down again, his hands trembling slightly as he cleared more dirt. The outline of the door became clearer now, and the shape was unmistakable, a door that had been sealed for years, maybe decades. A cold feeling gripped his chest as he reached out, brushing the dirt away from the metal handle. Rook's growl deepened a warning that Ethan couldn't ignore. "Easy, boy," he whispered again, but Rook wasn't backing down. The dog knew something Ethan didn't, and in that moment, Ethan knew this wasn't just a construction site anymore. This was something far more dangerous. And whatever was behind that door, it was about to change everything. Ethan's fingers trembled as he brushed away the last of the dirt from the metal handle. It felt colder than it should, as though it had been waiting there untouched for years. The exposed door loomed in front of him, its metal surface worn, but solid, its edges lined with rust. It was as though the earth had tried to bury it for good, but now it was calling to him, demanding attention. He couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a forgotten relic. This was something more, something hidden for a reason. Rook's growl continued low and steady. The dog was more than just a companion. He was a warning system, an extension of Ethan's own instincts. And right now those instincts were screaming at him to walk away, to leave this well enough alone. But Ethan couldn't. The door was right in front of him, like a puzzle waiting to be solved. He needed to know what lay beneath the surface. The thoughts raced through his head. Should he call someone? Should he stop digging and report this to the foreman? But then that knot in his stomach tightened. What if the others didn't take it seriously? What if they buried it again, just like they'd done with so many things in the past? The thought of that made his blood run cold. He wasn't about to let something this important slip through the cracks. Ethan stood up slowly, wiping the sweat off his brow, his mind still spinning. The sound of the construction crew in the distance seemed muffled now, as if the world had narrowed down to just him, Rook, and the door. He looked at Rook, who hadn't stopped watching the spot where the door lay, his gaze intense and unwavering. The dog knew something was wrong, and in his heart, Ethan knew it too. The door wasn't just a piece of forgotten infrastructure. It was a gateway to something darker. A heavy silence hung in the air. The buzzing of machinery in the background, the distant chatter of the crew. Everything seemed distant now, like it was happening in another world. Ethan crouched down again, his breath steady, trying to ignore the unease gnawing at him. His hand hovered over the metal surface of the door, the weight of years pressing down on him. He couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that this was more than just a construction find. It was something deeply tied to his past, to the years he'd spent in the military. He had seen things uncovered, things that were meant to stay hidden. But even then, none of it felt as personal as this. As his fingers brushed the door's surface, a sudden thought struck him. What if this door had been buried for a reason? What if it was something meant to stay forgotten? His heart raced at the thought, but curiosity won over. He couldn't turn back now. He had to know what was behind it. Before he could stop himself, his hands gripped the handle. The cold metal was stiff, at first resisting, as if it had been locked shut for decades. With a grunt, Ethan twisted the handle, the metal groaning, as it shifted. Suddenly, Rook's growl escalated into a sharp bark, and the ground beneath Ethan's feet seemed to shift. The dog took a step forward, teeth bared, but Ethan didn't move. His heart thudded in his chest, and for the first time in a long while, he felt that old familiar rush of adrenaline, the kind he hadn't experienced since his days in the field. The door creaked open slightly, just enough to let a gust of cold air slip through. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the faint scent of something old, stale, and metallic filled his lungs. It was like nothing he'd ever smelled before, too distinct to ignore, too ominous to dismiss. Ethan hesitated for just a second, his mind swirling with questions, but he couldn't stop himself. With a swift motion, he pushed the door open wider, and the darkness beyond seemed to swallow the light. Rook's bark was louder now, urgent, as though warning him, telling him to stop before it was too late. Ethan took a step back, his heart pounding as he stared into the blackness behind the door. It felt like the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting. The weight of the decision settled heavily on Ethan's shoulders. He had crossed a line, and there was no turning back now. What lay beyond this door? The question hung in the air as the wind picked up the leaves rustling around them, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the secrets buried in this land weren't just buried for the sake of history, they were buried to protect something far more dangerous than he could ever have imagined. The air was still, but Ethan could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, thick with the sense of something about to break. His hand hovered over the dark opening, the cold air from inside the hidden chamber, brushing against his face, sending a chill down his spine. Rook, still tense and alert, stood beside him, his growl quieter now, but no less menacing. The dog could sense it, the same unease that had gripped Ethan since the moment the bucket had struck something solid beneath the earth. Ethan took another cautious step back. The door, which had creaked open slightly, seemed to resist his touch, as if it had been sealed for far too long. And yet, despite the fear gnawing at him, he felt an undeniable pull to discover what lay beyond. His curiosity, the same drive that had led him to confront battles in foreign lands, now tugged at him with the same intensity. He knew he couldn't walk away without answers. The construction crew was still scattered across the site, absorbed in their work, unaware of the mystery unfolding just yards away. Ethan's mind raced as he stared into the blackness beyond the door, wondering what he would find, and more importantly, what would happen if he exposed whatever secret had been buried here. The ground had trembled beneath his feet when the door shifted, but that wasn't the only thing that unsettled him. The dog's growl had changed. It wasn't just a warning, now it was an alarm. Ethan's pulse quickened, and his military instincts kicked in. He knew that when danger lurked, hesitation could be deadly. But this wasn't the battlefield. This was supposed to be just another construction project, a way to move on from his past and build a future. The thought of unraveling something so forgotten, so deeply buried, filled him with a strange, uncomfortable excitement. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Rook," he muttered, half to the dog and half to himself. "Stay here." With one final glance at the dog, he stepped forward, moving closer to the door. His fingers brushed the metal again, the texture rough beneath his fingertips. The door creaked louder this time, as though it were protesting his every movement. But Ethan pressed on his heartbeat, thundering in his chest. He yanked the door open with more force this time, the hinges groaning in protest. The stale air rushed past him, thick and heavy with the smell of rust and decay. The door swung wide, revealing a narrow corridor that seemed to stretch into infinite darkness. It was a tight fit, barely wide enough for a man to pass through, but it was just enough for Ethan to see something at the far end, a faint outline of what appeared to be a concrete wall. His mind spun with questions. Why was this here? What had it been used for? And more troubling, what was the real reason it had been sealed away? But before he could step inside, a voice broke the silence. A shout from across the site, a worker calling out. Ethan jerked his head toward the sound, his senses snapping back into focus. The moment had passed. The door, the dark space beyond, the overwhelming pull of curiosity, it all had to wait. "Wilson," It was Dale, the foreman, waving him over the tall man's face, flushed with sweat. "What's going on over there? Everything okay?" Ethan hesitated. He glanced at Rook, still watching from the edge of the site, his ears perked up, his eyes wide. The dog had been right. Something wasn't right. But how could he explain this? The buried door, the metallic scent in the air, the feeling that he had just uncovered a part of something that was never meant to be found. "Yeah," Ethan called back, forcing his voice steady. "Just some old debris. I'll get back to it in a minute." Dale, clearly not convinced, raised an eyebrow, but turned back to the crew, giving a short nod. Ethan stood there for a moment, longer staring at the door. The smell of rust and earth still clung to the air around him, but now there was something else, a tension he hadn't noticed before. The question echoed louder than ever. What was hidden beyond this door? As Ethan took one last look at the entrance, the weight of the decision hit him again. The secret had been buried for a reason, and the more he uncovered, the deeper he'd be drawn into something far bigger than he could control. But for now, the door would stay shut, at least for the time being. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had just begun. And somewhere deep inside, Ethan knew it wasn't just the land that was hiding something. It was the people who had once walked here long before he and Rook ever set foot on this soil. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity, but Ethan's mind never left the door. It gnawed at him, the thought of what he had uncovered, buried deep in his chest, like a stone he couldn't ignore. Every time he swung the excavator's bucket or moved the dirt, it felt like the machine was moving him farther from the truth. He couldn't shake the image of the narrow corridor, the dark passage that seemed to call to him, urging him to look deeper. Rook, too, seemed uneasy. The dog had stopped growling, but the air around him was tense, his ears constantly flicking back, as if listening for something. Every time the veteran glanced over, he caught the dog's piercing stare, as though Rook knew something Ethan didn't, something dangerous. At lunch, the crew gathered around, their laughter and chatter filling the air, but Ethan couldn't focus. His hands still felt cold from touching the door, and his stomach twisted with a sense of impending doom. He couldn't put it out of his mind. Whatever had been hidden there, whatever secret the earth had kept buried for so long, was calling to him. "Hey, Wilson," Dale's voice broke through Ethan's thoughts. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Everything good?" Ethan gave a tight smile, trying to mask the unease. "Yeah, just a long morning. You know how it is." Dale chuckled, but Ethan could see the suspicion in the man's eyes. The foreman had noticed his distracted behavior, but Ethan wasn't about to share what he'd found, not yet. He wasn't even sure how to begin explaining it. How could he tell them that the land was hiding something more than just old debris? He barely understood it himself. As the afternoon wore on, Ethan found himself drawn back to the trench. The workers continued their tasks, oblivious to the fact that the land they were digging through held more than just dirt. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the site, Ethan made his way to the trench again, this time with more purpose. Rook followed him without hesitation, staying close, his eyes never leaving the site. Ethan knelt beside the exposed slab of concrete, his fingers brushing against the cold surface once more. The air felt thicker now, heavier, with the promise of something waiting to be uncovered. With a final glance around to make sure no one was watching, Ethan gently pressed against the metal door, and it creaked open just a little further. Suddenly he heard a noise. A voice, faint but clear, coming from the edge of the site. "Wilson." It was Dale again, but this time his voice was different, urgent, sharp. "Where are you? We need you over here now." Ethan froze, his hand still on the door. For a moment he hesitated. The tension in the air felt like it was about to snap. But the moment passed, and he reluctantly pulled away from the door, sealing it back with dirt. "Coming," he muttered, walking away from the mystery once more, but knowing it wasn't over. Whatever was behind that door had only just begun to pull him in. The days that followed the discovery of the hidden door seemed to stretch on forever. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something massive, something that he was meant to uncover, whether he wanted to or not. Rook, ever watchful, was his silent partner through it all. The dog's unease only deepened, And it wasn't just the strange discovery weighing on Ethan's mind. It was the way everything had started to shift. The world around him had subtly changed. The construction crew seemed oblivious to the significance of what had been uncovered. But Ethan was different now. He couldn't stop thinking about the concrete slab, the mysterious door, and the hollow air that had rushed out when it creaked open. The thought of what was hidden beneath the earth gnawed at him. But it wasn't just the door, it was what lay behind it. Something older than the highway. Something buried for a reason. The foreman Dale had become more distant, noticing Ethan's increasing distraction, but he said nothing more than a passing comment about getting back to work. But Ethan could feel it. He was being watched, though not overtly. There was a sense of quiet surveillance, as though the powers that be were taking a deeper interest in his work. Rook's behavior was more erratic now. He'd always been the kind of dog to sit still, watching with that intense gaze. But lately, he'd been more restless, pacing around their small cabin at night, his ears perked up, as if listening to sounds only he could hear. It was as though Rook knew something new. They were being pulled deeper into a web they hadn't even begun to understand. One afternoon after the crew had wrapped up their work, Ethan returned to the trench alone. The worksite had grown quieter. With the end of the day, the distant hum of machinery replaced by the chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves in the wind. Ethan walked slowly, taking in the stillness before his gaze fell back on the exposed slab. He couldn't resist it. He knelt beside it again, brushing the dirt away cautiously. His fingers touched the metal cold to the touch, and the hair on the back of his neck stood up. This time, something was different. The air was heavier, the silence more oppressive. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. Without thinking, he pulled at the handle again, and the door creaked open further, just enough to let the dimming light of the late afternoon seep inside. But this time, something more than just air rushed out, a faint musty smell that reminded him of old storage rooms or forgotten cellars. It was thick with the scent of something long sealed away. He hesitated for a moment, but then, as if on instinct, he stepped inside. The air was cooler inside the narrow corridor, as if the earth itself had been holding its breath. The walls were made of smooth concrete, cracked in places, but still intact. Ethan's flashlight swept across the darkness, revealing nothing but more concrete, a narrow path that led to an unseen end. The temperature in the tunnel was a strange contrast to the warmth of the outside world. As he moved deeper, the silence wrapped around him like a blanket pressing in on his chest. His mind raced with questions. Why was this here? What was it for? And more importantly, why had it been sealed so tightly? He continued to walk, the sound of his footsteps echoing softly in the confined space, as Rook stayed just outside his low growls, carrying faintly through the narrow opening. Suddenly, Ethan froze. His light caught something on the floor of the corridor. He knelt down, brushing aside the dust and debris. His hand closed around what seemed to be an old, rusted lockbox. It was small, no larger than a shoebox, but the weight of it was undeniable. He lifted it carefully, examining the faded, scratched surface. The lockbox was sealed tight, its mechanism worn with age. His pulse quickened as he wondered what secrets this box might hold. Had it been left behind, hidden in the earth for decades? What had it been meant to protect? The questions flooded his mind, but the answer eluded him. Ethan's fingers brushed over the lock as he tried to open it, but the rust had made it stiff, nearly impossible to move. He took a breath, frustrated but determined. He needed to know what was inside. Just as he was about to force the box open, a sound echoed from behind him. A faint creaking noise, then another. Ethan spun around, hard in his throat, his breath coming in short gasps. But there was nothing there, just the same empty corridor. His mind raced, but Rook's growl from outside the tunnel snapped him back to reality. He couldn't ignore the feeling that he wasn't alone in this place. Something had been disturbed, something that shouldn't have been. He hurriedly closed the box and tucked it into his bag. He needed to get out of there, but the path back was no longer clear. The unease in his gut had blossomed into something deeper, darker. It was as though the very earth beneath him had shifted, and he wasn't sure he could trust it anymore. The deeper he went into this mystery, the more he realized there was something far more dangerous waiting. As he backed out of the tunnel, a voice echoed in his mind. This wasn't just about a hidden structure. It was about something bigger, something that had been buried for a reason. And now the truth was clawing its way to the surface. Rook's growl became sharper, more insistent, just as a shadow passed over the tunnel's entrance. Was it too late to walk away? What had he really uncovered? And more importantly, who would come for it? Next. Ethan walked quickly back to the trench, the weight of the lockbox pressing against his chest. He needed answers, answers that were rapidly slipping through his fingers, even as the mystery deepened. Rook's growl faded as he approached, and the dog's watchful eyes followed his every move. The unease that had been creeping at the edges of Ethan's mind now consumed him, settling heavy in his stomach. His hand trembled as he climbed out of the trench and back to the construction site. The workers had gone home for the day, leaving only a few scattered tools behind. The equipment, now silent, seemed to loom over the deserted site like specters. It felt wrong. The land felt wrong. Ethan glanced back at the trench, his gaze lingering on the spot where the door had once been. The secret he'd uncovered, the feeling of something pressing against his chest, didn't leave him. Every instinct screamed at him to walk away, to forget what he'd seen. But there was something in the core of his being that refused to let go. The part of him that had survived war, that had weathered storms both physical and emotional, was now telling him the truth was deeper than he could have imagined. His heart pounded as he made his way back to the cabin, but Rook stayed close, padding silently beside him. They reached the door, and he paused, unsure if he should go inside or stay outside, where the fresh air would give him some semblance of clarity. The weight of the lockbox felt like a constant reminder of the path he'd chosen, a path he couldn't turn away from now. The secrets buried beneath this land, beneath this highway, weren't just remnants of forgotten history. They were clues pointing to something bigger. Ethan stepped inside and set the lockbox down on the kitchen table. His cabin was small and unassuming, filled with old furniture and the faint scent of cedar. The windows were open, letting in the cool evening air. He needed to calm his mind. He needed to think. He could feel the presence of the dog behind him, like a quiet sentinel watching and waiting for any sign of danger. Ethan ran his fingers over the surface of the box, still caked with dirt. His heart raced again, and the familiar taste of unease rose in his throat. He sat down at the table, the box in front of him, and the dog settled at his feet. There was no turning back. He had crossed a line. Whatever was inside this box, whatever was hidden beneath the earth, would soon consume him. What had he uncovered? The sound of Rook's nails clicking on the wooden floor broke the silence. Ethan reached into his bag and pulled out the journal he'd kept during his time in the military, the pages worn from years of handling. He flipped through the old, yellowing pages, the ink faded, but still legible. His mind drifted back to the time when he had been overseas, to the memories of the things he'd done, the people he'd met, and the secrets he had uncovered. The journal had been his way of coping, of holding on to something from the past that didn't involve the chaos of war. But the past always had a way of catching up. There in the back of the journal was a memory he'd tried to bury, a mission that had been marked with secrecy, a covert operation where the truth had been buried under layers of red tape. The military had been good at that, burying the truth, erasing evidence, making things disappear as if they never existed. But Ethan had seen through it. He knew something had been hidden, something valuable. But it had never made sense. The journal contained a name, Richard Holloway. He had been the mayor of a small town Ethan had passed through once. Holloway had been involved in shady dealings, things the veteran had been told to ignore, but Ethan had never been good at ignoring things. As the years passed, Holloway's name had faded from memory, but the corruption, the lies, it had never stopped. It had festered under the surface, spreading like an infection waiting to be uncovered. Ethan's eyes darted to the lockbox. Could it be? Was it possible that the man who had once been tied to that name had also been tied to what was buried beneath this very land? The unease that had gripped Ethan now surged into something else, fear. Fear that the truth he had uncovered had much deeper roots than just a highway project. It was connected to something much darker. His breath quickened as he opened the box, the metal latch scraping against the rust. Inside, he found what he had feared, a stack of yellowed papers, old files, and a set of faded photographs. Each page was filled with familiar names, names of contractors, workers, and politicians, all linked together by a single thread of corruption. The files were from the early 1980s, a time when Holloway had been at the height of his power. One photograph caught Ethan's eye, a picture of a large, imposing building with a sign that read, Holloway Dam Project. The names beneath it were all too familiar. The same companies, the same faces. He had heard rumors about the project, whispers about money being funneled into the wrong hands, about the disappearance of funds meant for construction. But no one had ever confirmed it. Until now. Ethan's eyes scanned the papers quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. The truth he had uncovered, the corruption tied to Holloway's name, was undeniable. The land he stood on, the very earth beneath his feet, had been part of something far bigger than just a highway. It was a cover-up, a conspiracy that had been buried and forgotten until now. But the questions were multiplying in his mind. How deep did this go? Who else had been involved? Why had this been kept hidden for so long? And more pressing, why now Rook's growl broke through his thoughts again, this time sharper and more insistent. Ethan turned around, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the cabin. The dog was staring at the door, his body tense. There was something out there. Something was closing in. Without thinking, Ethan grabbed the lockbox and stuffed it back into his bag. He quickly pulled on his jacket and motioned for Rook to stay close. The air around him felt charged, as if the walls of the cabin were closing in. The silence had shifted. The stillness was now filled with tension, as if the earth itself was waiting for something to happen. Outside, the shadows of dusk stretched long across the land. Ethan's instincts kicked in. He knew they weren't alone anymore. The world was shifting, and he had just uncovered a secret that would change everything. But who was coming for it now? Ethan's pulse raced as he grabbed his flashlight and stepped into the growing darkness of the evening. The uneasy feeling that had settled in his gut since uncovering the box deepened with every passing second. Rook was by his side, his ears up, and alert, his steps silent against the dusty wooden floor as they moved toward the door. The dog's instincts were sharper than ever, and Ethan trusted them more than his own. Something was off. As Ethan opened the door, the cool evening air hit him sharp and biting. The land around him stretched out in silence, but he could feel it, the tension in the air, thick, like something waiting to be unleashed. He stepped onto the porch, Rook close behind his eyes, scanning the shadows that clung to the edges of the property. The faint rustling of leaves filled the silence, but there was no sign of movement. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. It was a feeling that went deeper than just the usual quiet of the woods. It was the kind of feeling you get when you're being hunted. The kind of feeling he had experienced during his time in the military, when you knew your enemy was just out of sight, waiting to strike. He looked around again, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife that he always kept tucked in his belt. The familiar weight comforted him, but it did little to ease the dread growing in the pit of his stomach. He had uncovered something too dangerous, something that was never meant to be found. And now someone knew. Rook suddenly stiffened beside him, his body rigid, his eyes locked on the tree line. Ethan froze, his heart hammered in his chest. The dog was reacting to something unseen. Before he could make sense of it, a sound reached his ears, a faint crackle followed by the rustling of footsteps through the underbrush. He wasn't alone. Ethan's instincts kicked into overdrive. Who would be out here? The nearest town was miles away, and the construction site was deserted for the day. The only other people around were the workers, and they had all left. Yet here now, at his cabin, someone was moving in the shadows. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. His hand gripped the knife tighter as he stepped into the yard, eyes darting to every corner. The footsteps were getting closer, but they were muffled, deliberate. Someone was trying to move quietly, but they weren't trying hard enough. Rook growled again, this time louder. His hackles raised, his eyes never leaving the line of trees ahead. Ethan took another step forward, every muscle in his body coiled ready for action. He wished he had more time, wished he could make sense of what was happening, but his mind was racing too fast. He couldn't afford to hesitate. Was it the authorities? Had someone found out about the documents he'd uncovered? But no, these weren't the steady, deliberate movements of trained professionals. Whoever it was, they were clumsy, anxious. The uneven steps, the way the leaves were disturbed. This wasn't someone who knew how to move unseen. So, who was it? Before he could make a decision, a figure stepped out from behind a tree. Ethan's hand flew to his side, the knife's hilt cold against his palm, as he prepared to defend himself. But then the figure spoke. "Ethan, it's me." The voice was familiar. It was Dale, the foreman from the construction site. Ethan blinked in confusion, his grip on the knife relaxing slightly, but his caution remained. Dale stepped further into the light, his face flushed and damp with sweat, his eyes darting around nervously. "What the hell are you doing here, Dale?" Ethan demanded, his voice low, but edged with suspicion. He couldn't remember inviting anyone to his cabin. Dale's eyes flicked to Rook, still tense, and then back to Ethan. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice tight. I think we've made a mistake, and I think it's too late to cover it up." Ethan's brow furrowed, his mind racing. Cover it up? What was he talking about? The unease he had felt earlier intensified, and he felt his heartbeat quicken again. "What mistake?" Ethan asked sharply. "What are you talking about?" Dale glanced nervously over his shoulder before stepping closer. His movements were fast, almost too fast, like he was trying to escape something or someone. Ethan's stomach dropped. This wasn't right. "Look," Dale said, lowering his voice. "I didn't want to get involved in this, but after everything that happened with the highway project, I realized that we've been digging into something that's bigger than we thought." He paused, his eyes scanning the area, clearly on edge. "I know you found something you weren't supposed to." Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears. "What do you mean, Dale? What did I find?" He didn't want to admit it, but the urgency in Dale's voice made his instincts flare again. Something was wrong, and the deeper he went, the more dangerous it would get. Dale's face was pale, and his hands trembled as he reached into his pocket. "It's connected to the old Mayor Holloway. His name's on some of the stuff we dug up. I don't know how, but it's all tied together. The land, the buildings, the history here, it's all part of it. And I think that's why they've been watching you." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the stomach. Hollowisat, the same Holloway from the documents in the lockbox. "Why would they be watching me?" Ethan asked, his voice growing cold. "Who is they?" Dale's eyes widened, and he stepped closer, lowering his voice even more. "I don't know, but I've seen them. The suits, the men who came by the site a couple of days ago. They aren't inspectors. They're not from any government office. They've been tracking you, watching everything you've been doing." Ethan's mind spun as the pieces fell into place. The suits at the site, the warning from Rook, the unease in his gut. It wasn't paranoia. It was real. Someone had been following him, had been watching what he uncovered. Dale continued, his voice shaking. "We're in too deep. And now they want to make sure no one talks about what's buried out here. What you found, it's too dangerous. We're all at risk." And the sound of tires on gravel cut him off. Ethan's heart froze. Someone was coming. Rook's growl returned louder this time, and as the noise grew closer, Ethan realized this wasn't just a warning. This was the moment the other shoe would drop, the moment he couldn't run from the truth any longer. But would they let him speak the truth? The sound of a car door slamming echoed across the yard. The time for answers was over. The chase had begun. The car door slammed shut in the distance, and Ethan's pulse quickened. His instincts screamed at him to act. Dale was still standing there, visibly shaking, his hands twitching at his sides, but Ethan barely noticed him. His focus was on the sound approaching a vehicle, a new set of boots on his land. Someone was coming for him. Rook's growl escalated to a deep, menacing sound that rattled Ethan's nerves. The dog, as always, was more attuned to danger than anyone, and now the animal was on edge, his body taut, his eyes scanning the edge of the woods where the shadows were beginning to grow long. Ethan's mind raced, piecing together everything that had happened. Dale's sudden visit, the strange men at the construction site, the secret locked in the box. Something was escalating. The night air seemed colder now, pressing in on him from all sides, and the familiar sounds of the woods, chirping insects, rustling leaves, suddenly felt like an eerie silence. His hand went to the knife at his waist instinctively, though the pull of the weapon felt weak compared to the urgency building in his chest. Ethan's eyes locked on the narrow dirt road that led to his cabin, watching for any sign of movement. In the distance, headlights pierced through the thickening night, casting long, distorted shadows across the yard. The vehicle's engine hummed in the distance, steady and deliberate. Whoever was coming knew exactly where they were going. He turned back to Dale, who was still standing there wide-eyed, as if he had just realized the full weight of what they were both about to face. "What's happening, Dale?" Ethan's voice was calm, but underneath it was laced with barely controlled panic. He couldn't afford to show fear now, not with what was at stake, not when he wasn't sure who was on his side. I don't know," Dale muttered, shaking his head as if trying to clear the fog from his mind. "They're after the documents, after what we found." "I'm not supposed to be here." He glanced nervously toward the approaching vehicle. "But I had to warn you. I don't know how long we have." The headlights grew brighter as the car turned off the main road, pulling onto the gravel driveway in front of Ethan's cabin. The vehicle, a black SUV, came to a stop with a soft crunch of tires against the dirt. The low hum of the engine ceased, and for a moment the silence was deafening. A figure stepped out of the SUV, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a suit. His features were obscured in the shadows, but Ethan could make out the confident way he moved, the purposeful stride that spoke of someone who wasn't used to being challenged. Behind him, two more figures emerged, similarly dressed, their faces hidden behind dark sunglasses, despite the fading daylight. Dale's breath caught in his throat. "I told you." His voice faltered, and his hand trembled at his side. He was backing away slowly, a sense of finality in his every movement. "I'm sorry, Ethan. I shouldn't have come here. You should have stayed away from it." Before Ethan could respond, the man in the suit spoke, his voice smooth and commanding, as if he had rehearsed these lines 1,000 times. "Ethan Ward," he said, his tone almost too polite. "I trust you've been, well," he looked at Dale, who was standing frozen near the porch, and then turned his gaze back to Ethan. "It's come to our attention that you've been poking around where you shouldn't, digging into things that are better left buried." Ethan's jaw tightened. He stood his ground, refusing to give in to the growing pressure. "What do you want?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I think you know what we want," he replied, stepping forward, his gaze cold and calculating. "The documents, the ones you've been hiding." He made a casual gesture toward Dale, who was still frozen on the porch. "We know you've uncovered something that's no longer safe." Ethan's heart sank. He thought about the lockbox, the papers inside it, the truth, and the way the ground had seemed to open up beneath him when it all clicked. Holloway, the corruption, the buried history that no one was supposed to remember. He had barely scratched the surface, and now it felt like everything was closing in on him. Dale's voice broke through the tension. "I didn't know it was this bad, Ethan. I swear I didn't know they'd come for you." His eyes were wide with fear, but there was a resignation in his voice that Ethan didn't miss. I thought we could just keep things quiet, but I should have known. This goes way higher than us." The figure in the suit stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Ethan. "This is bigger than you or me. It's bigger than Holloway. This is about power, and the last thing we need is a loose end." Ethan's mind raced. Power, corruption, hidden in plain sight. The pieces were falling into place, and the chilling realization hit him. He wasn't just caught up in some small-town secret anymore. This was something far more insidious, something that reached beyond his understanding. Before he could say another word, the man in the suit continued. "You've already done the hard part. Now it's time to hand over what you found." and we can go on with our lives. Ethan shook his head, his voice steady but his heart thudding in his chest. No, I'm not giving you anything. Not until I understand why you're here. Not until I know exactly what's going on. His eyes flicked to Rook, who was still at his side, growling low in his throat. You think I'm just going to hand over the truth? The man's lips curled into a smirk. I don't think you have much of a choice. Without warning, the two other figures in the SUV started walking toward Ethan, their hands resting on the guns at their hips. Ethan felt his body tense, the familiar rush of adrenaline flooding his veins. He took a half step back, Rook at his heels, his body coiled, ready to spring. You think you can intimidate me? Ethan's voice was low, but firm, his eyes never leaving the man in the suit. He wasn't going down without a fight, not this time. You're wrong. I'm not scared of you, and I'm not scared of your people. Whatever you're hiding, I'll expose it. The man's smirk faltered for a split second, but then it was back cold and cruel. You have no idea what you're up against, Ethan, but you will soon enough, Rook barked sharply, breaking the tension for a moment. And in that instant, Ethan saw the opening, the faintest crack in their composure. He glanced down at his dog. The world around him seemed to slow as adrenaline flooded his senses. It was time to act. With a sudden movement, Ethan pulled the knife from his belt, the cool steel flashing in the dying light. He took a step back toward the cabin, keeping his eyes trained on the man in the suit. Stay away from me, he warned. The man's eyes narrowed, his hand twitching toward his sidearm. Last chance, Ward. You don't want this to get ugly. Ethan felt a rush of clarity, the kind he had felt on the battlefield when survival depended on instinct. He wasn't going down without a fight. As the two men began to close the distance, Rook barked again, this time with urgency. Ethan's heart pounded, and he knew in that moment, whatever was about to happen, it was the beginning of something that could change everything. But what would happen next? Would he survive this night? And more importantly, would the truth survive? The tension in the air felt suffocating, as if the very earth beneath Ethan's feet was holding its breath. His grip tightened around the knife's hilt, the metal cold against his palm. Rook was right beside him, the dog's low growl vibrating through the silence. The night was still, but every sound felt amplified. The soft rustling of the leaves, the distant hum of the highway, the pounding of Ethan's own heart. The men in suits were closing in. The SUV was parked a few yards away, its headlights casting long, sharp shadows across the yard, illuminating the figures who had stepped out. Ethan's mind raced, weighing his options. He had no idea how many of them were here, but it didn't matter. He had to act. The dog's growls had shifted from warning to an unmistakable signal. Something was about to happen. Stay back, Ethan said, his voice steady but low. The man in the suit, the one who had spoken earlier, raised his hand slightly, an almost theatrical gesture. He was trying to seem unthreatening, but there was no mistaking the cold calculation behind his eyes. You're out of your depth, Ward, the man said, his voice smooth, almost coaxing. This is bigger than you think. Hand over the documents, and we can walk away from this. No harm done. Ethan felt the rush of adrenaline flood his system, sharpening his senses. He wasn't backing down. Not now. Not after everything. You've already caused enough harm. I'm not letting you bury this. Rook's growl grew deeper, a warning that sent a ripple of unease through the men. Ethan could see the momentary hesitation in the suit's eyes. The dog wasn't just a companion. He was a reminder of the unpredictability that lurked just beneath the surface. You're not in control here? The man continued, his voice tinged with frustration now. We can make this easy for you, but if you keep pushing, it won't end well. For you, for your dog, or anyone else. But Ethan wasn't listening anymore. The words felt like empty threats he had heard worse before. He had faced real danger in his past, and this was just another obstacle, another fight he had to survive. The thought of the documents, the truth they contained, made him even more resolute. He wasn't about to let anyone erase it, especially not these men. The man in the suit took a step closer, his hand brushing the gun at his side. Ethan noticed the movement, the way the suit's fingers tightened ever so slightly around the handle. His pulse quickened, but he didn't flinch. This was it. Time seemed to stretch. The world around him narrowed down to a single point, the space between him and the suit. Suddenly, Rook lunged forward, a blur of motion that caught the men off guard. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as the dog barked, charging straight at the suited figure. The man staggered back instinctively, reaching for his gun. But it was too late. Rook was on him, his teeth snapping his body, a solid mass of muscle and energy. The suit's hand shook as he tried to draw the weapon, but Rook was too fast. With a sharp bark, the dog knocked the man to the ground, his arm pinned beneath Rook's weight. The other two figures froze, uncertain of how to respond. Ethan didn't waste a second. His muscles locked into place as he sprang forward, his hand still clutching the knife. He reached the man in the suit before he could recover, his voice low and commanding as he crouched beside him. "Get up," Ethan growled, his eyes hard as stone. The man hesitated, but the dog's snarls were enough to convince him. He slowly rose, shaking his face, pale from the shock. Ethan kept the knife steady in his hand, his gaze never leaving the man. The other two figures backed away, slightly unsure of what to do next. Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but his focus remained clear. This wasn't over. "I don't know who you work for, but I'm not backing down," Ethan said, his voice calm, but filled with a quiet resolve. "You want the truth, you'll have to take it from me." The man in the suit didn't move at first, but his eyes flicked to his colleagues. For a brief moment, Ethan saw something change in him, an understanding that things had gone too far. He wasn't in control anymore. Then, as quickly as the tension had escalated, it collapsed. The man in the suit stepped back, signaling to the others. "We're done here," he said, his voice clipped and strained. "But don't think for a second this is over, Ward. You're in way too deep." Ethan didn't lower the knife. He held his ground, his eyes locked on the retreating figures. "You'll never erase the truth," he called after them, his voice steady, unwavering. "It's out now, and I'll make sure it stays that way." The men hesitated for a moment, but then turned and walked back toward the SUV. One of them shot Ethan a glance, his eyes dark, but no words followed. The car doors slammed shut, and in the space of a few seconds, the engine roared to life. The vehicle backed out of the driveway and disappeared into the night, leaving only the faint dust behind. Ethan stood there for a long time, his breath coming in ragged bursts as the adrenaline slowly faded. Rook, still alert, stayed close by his side, his eyes scanning the darkness. The yard was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence, a stillness that carried the weight of what had just happened. The truth was out there now. It had been uncovered, and nothing would ever be the same. Ethan didn't know what came next, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a strange sense of relief. The truth was alive, and no one would be able to bury it again. He turned to head back inside, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. But as he reached the door, a thought crossed his mind, one that made his stomach tighten once more. What would happen now? Would the men in the suits really let it go? Or would they come back? Ethan didn't know. All he could do was prepare for whatever came next. But he knew this for sure. He wouldn't run. The truth had already begun to change everything, and there was no going back. Ethan stood at the threshold of the cabin, his breath steadying, as the sound of the SUV's engine faded into the distance. The night felt heavy around him, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Rook was still by his side, the dog's posture relaxed but alert, as though he knew this wasn't the end, only a brief lull before the storm. Ethan wiped his palms against his jeans, the knife still in his grip, but his pulse had slowed, returning to some semblance of normality. His eyes, however, remained sharp, scanning the darkened yard for any further movement. Despite the silence, a part of him knew this wasn't over. He had only just scratched the surface of something far deeper than he'd ever imagined. The men in suits were gone, but their threat still lingered like a bad smell. They hadn't just come for the documents, they'd come for him. Ethan's thoughts swirled as he turned to enter the cabin, feeling the weight of everything that had just transpired. Inside, he sat at the small kitchen table, his hands folded on top of the lockbox. He hadn't opened it yet, hadn't dared to not after what had just happened. The documents inside were dangerous, he knew that much. But now they held more than just government corruption. They were proof of the lengths people would go to protect their power. Rook padded over to the corner, curling up as he always did when things were quiet. Ethan looked at the dog gratitude washing over him. Without Rook, there was no telling what might have happened tonight. He could feel the unease creeping back in, tightening around his chest. The events of the day had left him with more questions than answers. The men who had confronted him had been too organized, too calm to be local. They were sent by someone higher up. But who? And why did they think they could intimidate him? As his mind churned, the thought kept gnawing at him. Had they been watching him all along? Had they known from the moment he'd arrived in this small town that he would stumble across something he shouldn't have? The realization was a bitter one. The network of power and corruption wasn't just a distant shadow. It had roots deep and entrenched in the very places Ethan had once thought were safe. It was all connected, stretching back decades, with Holloway's name at the center of it all. Ethan was just the latest person to stumble into the truth. But the truth Ethan realized was dangerous. People died for it. People disappeared. His eyes flicked to the lockbox, his hand hovering above it, but he hesitated. There was a part of him that wanted to leave it all behind, to walk away from this mess and never look back. But another part of him, the part that had been forged in battle, the part that had faced death and survived, would never be able to let it go. He took a deep breath and opened the box. Inside, the papers were neatly stacked, the edges yellowed with age, but the text was still clear. The names, the companies, the contractors, it was all there. A trail of corruption, a web spun by people who thought they were untouchable. And now it was his responsibility to make sure the truth came out. But as he sifted through the papers, one document stood out. A photograph. It was of Gerald Reeves. Ethan's hand trembled as he reached for it, recognizing the face from his past, a man he had never met, but whose story was now intertwined with his own. This was the moment Ethan had feared, the point of no return. He was no longer just a man trying to survive. He was now part of something far bigger than himself. And there was no turning back. The door creaked open behind him, and Ethan stiffened. His hand instinctively went to his side, where the knife rested. But it wasn't another intruder. It was Dale, his face pale, his eyes wide with uncertainty. He'd been watching from the porch, no doubt waiting for a sign that things were still under control. "We need to leave." "They'll be back," Dale said urgently, his voice trembling. Ethan didn't answer at first. He just sat there, staring at the photograph of Gerald Reeves, his mind racing. This wasn't about just protecting the truth anymore. It was about survival. Dale stepped forward, his gaze flicking to the lockbox. "What did you find, Ethan?" Ethan closed the box slowly, the weight of the decision settling on him. "The truth," he said softly. "And it's bigger than we thought. We can't just hide anymore, Dale. We need to expose this. All of it." Dale looked at him, his face a mixture of fear and resolve. "And what happens if we do? They'll kill us for it." Ethan met his gaze. "Then we fight." This was the moment of no return. The storm outside raged on the wind, howling through the trees as Ethan and Dale exchanged a glance. They both knew the danger they were in, but there was no turning back. The truth was out, and with it came consequences. As the two men prepared to leave the cabin, Ethan's hand closed around the stack of documents one last time. His mind was made up. They had no choice now but to face whatever was coming, because the truth would always be more powerful than the lies. And the truth had a way of coming for those who tried to bury it. The next morning, the storm had passed. The sun rose slowly over the hills, casting a soft, golden light over the land. The trees that had bent and swayed in the violent wind the night before now stood tall, their branches swaying gently in the morning breeze. Everything was calm, as if nothing had happened, as if the world had settled back into its routine, its natural rhythm. But Ethan knew better. Nothing would ever be the same. The air felt different, lighter somehow, as if it carried the weight of what had been uncovered. The truth was no longer just buried beneath the earth. It had risen, and now it would not be silenced. He stood on the porch of the cabin, looking out at the land that had been his refuge for so long. The place that had once felt so safe, so far removed from the chaos of the world, now felt like a battleground, a place where something had been awakened, and there was no going back. Rook was at his side, sitting quietly, his eyes scanning the horizon. The dog had been more than just a companion. Through this journey, he had been a constant reminder of the bond between loyalty and survival, between the instinct to protect and the will to fight for what was right. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the crisp morning air fill his lungs. It was peaceful this moment, a rare stillness before the storm. His hand rested on Rook's head, feeling the warmth of the dog's fur, the steady pulse of his breath. The road ahead was uncertain. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear: the fight wasn't over. There were still obstacles to overcome, still people to face, and the truth would still be hunted. But for the first time, he felt a sense of purpose. He knew what he had to do. The photograph of Gerald Reeves, tucked carefully in his bag, was a reminder of the past, of the price paid for seeking the truth and the lives destroyed by corruption. But it was also a symbol of hope. The truth had survived. It had been buried for too long, but it was out now, and nothing could bury it again. Ethan stepped off the porch, his boots crunching softly against the gravel. He walked toward the dirt road that led out from the cabin, his eyes on the horizon. Rook followed closely behind, steady and resolute, the dog's loyal presence, a silent promise that they were in this together. In the distance, the faint sound of a truck engine rumbled, but it wasn't a sound that caused him alarm. It was the sound of the world continuing, moving forward. Whatever had been buried, whatever had been hidden, would now be brought into the light. And that, Ethan realized, was all that mattered. As the truck drew closer, he felt the weight of the past few days lift ever so slightly. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, he didn't feel alone on it. With Rook at his side and the truth in his heart, Ethan knew he could face whatever came next. The sun was fully risen now, bathing the land in warmth, the golden light spreading across the fields like a new beginning. And with that, he turned his gaze back to the road ahead. The journey was just beginning.